Welcome to the 200th episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. Happy New Year to all of you, and I'm here at the News Forum where all voices matter. Homelessness is an economic and social challenge, of course, and it has not gone away. But how advocates frame the issue has changed markedly over the years. From ways to get people off the streets and into shelter, we have moved to the rights of the homeless to settle in our parks, our streets, and our public spaces. Here to discuss this topic is Patrick Luciani. He is a senior political writer for The Hub. Welcome, Patrick, to the program.
Nice to be with you, Tony.
I guess my first question is, I did my own little definition of the journey we've been on looking at homelessness, but how would you define the homelessness issue?
How would I define it? Well, people who are struggling actually day to day to find suitable places to live, to accommodate themselves, perhaps even their families. And various people fall into the category of homelessness, but I'm really talking about, or I'm thinking about people with chronic problems with employment, medical issues that simply can't, in a sense, get their lives together to find adequate housing.
Right.
That's pretty much, that's a very rough definition, I suppose.
And would you define this as an issue that's getting worse in our urban and I guess even our rural areas, or has it been static? Or how would you assess it right now?
Well, from the numbers we have, it's pretty static as far as the number of people on the streets. That's from the numbers from Stats Canada.
Right.
And there are about 25 to 30,000 people, I think, are homeless, can be identified as homeless throughout the country at any given day. But the perception is, of course, that given COVID, given the economic downturn, that homelessness has actually gotten worse. And we've yet to see those numbers after this particular rough year.
Yeah, no, it'll be interesting to see, obviously, and I know there'll be a lot of commentary over the next few months precisely for that reason. One of the reasons why it sort of bubbled up to people's knowledge now was over the past summer, we saw visual images of the Toronto police being attacked at Toronto's Trinity Bellwoods Park for trying to clear out the encampment there. And I guess I'd love to get your sense of, there's obviously conflicting rights at play. The right of enjoyment for people of public spaces versus, as I said at the onset of this increasing view of the rights of the homeless to encamp. So I'd love to get your sense of how we deal with these competing interests.
Well, there has to be some sort of respect for compassion for the homeless, but also a sense that the law has to be obeyed. You simply can't pitch a tent or put together a sort of a ramshackle home on public property. This just doesn't work in a civil society. And so the city really John Tory had no choice but eventually to address the problem. And I thought he did a pretty good job of how he handled this. Now, I live close to Trinity Bellwoods, and I happened to be there the day that the homeless were actually cleared out. And it was done very quickly, efficiently. And I think we have to remember that the people who were moved out were moved into safer conditions. My concern was the media was quite harsh on how it was done.
Right.
In terms of the police presence. But what they didn't, the Globe and Mail and so on, what they didn't cover were the protesters who were advocating for the homeless to stay exactly where they are. And that's what sort of stimulated me to write a piece about it, in the sense that the people who were there harassing the cops, yelling at them, and so on, insisted that people, the most vulnerable among us, should live in such terrible conditions. And the question is, why? And that's why I actually wrote the piece.
Right. We're going to come back to that. We're going to take a brief break, Patrick. We'll be right back with you. So stay on the line, and our audience, please stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm here with Patrick Luciani. He's a senior political writer for The Hub. We're talking about the homelessness issue. Patrick, I had to break for commercial, but again, maybe describe a little bit about what you wrote, because that's what sparked my interest in having this discussion. What you wrote in The Hub about your assessment of the homelessness issue right now.
Well, the homelessness is an important problem. My piece was really about what were the motives of people who actually want to keep people in these tents,
right,
and living rough. And I came up with a couple of reasons for myself. I think that the homeless advocates, poverty advocates, need the homeless to live in our parks as a PR problem. They have to show society that there's a real problem of poverty, of a lack of housing, and so on. And they need people living in these parks, I think, and they're being used in a sense to show how deep the problem is and what's causing the problem. And most people, I think, not most people, but a lot of advocates think it's a problem of the cost of housing, for instance, or increasing rents, or lack of jobs. If you go into these parks, when there were these tents and these ramshackle shacks, what you find this is a deep health issue in Canada. It's an addictive issue. There's alcoholism, there's drug abuse, there's fentanyl use, there's injection sites. These have become very dangerous places, not only for the homeless, but for the public that actually use these parks. And I thought that people who really have a compassion for the poor, why would they want them to live in such dire straits, where they have no, conveniences that we've become used to? I mean, there's no water, there's no electricity, there's nowhere to prepare a meal, there's nothing. No one checks up on these places, and obviously the fire departments are constantly going out there to put out fires. And the people who are most concerned are the ones who seem to be least interested in at least providing safe housing for the homeless in these parks. The second reason is that I think that the advocates have also been influenced a lot by a progressive politics. That is, that people should be allowed to live however they want. If they commit crime, well, that's not their concern. That's just because the system has pushed them to crime. And so on. So we see the same problem, of course, exaggerated in the United States.
Right.
In San Francisco, of course, California, Washington State, and so on. And so there's a philosophical element here and a political agenda that a lot of poverty advocates actually endorse.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because at the same time that I read your article in The Hub about this, I was listening to Michael Schellenberger, who wrote a book recently called San Francisco, which described how liberal elites have actually made harm of the homeless much worse and have exacerbated the mental health and the addictions issues because of their approach. And that's what you're observing as well, right?
Well, there was an article that I referred to in my piece in the City Journal by Christopher Rufo, who was making the same points I was making in mine independently. And that is, in the States, homelessness has actually gone down over the last decade. And yet in places like Seattle and California, Washington and California, homelessness has gone up. And what they've done is that they've decriminalized some of these areas where the homeless in other parts of the country have moved to where they don't enforce the law. You can actually camp out, et cetera, without the without breaking the law in a sense. Now, I compared, Rufo basically compares Houston and Seattle and San Francisco. And he found that homelessness in Houston, for instance, has declined by almost 50% over the last 10 years. And the question is, what are they doing differently than what Los Angeles and San Francisco are doing? And they're enforcing.
Let me. I'm just going to break for another commercial break because I do want to talk about different models, what can be done differently. This is an important topic. I don't want to break it up. So stay tuned. We'll be right back after these messages.
All right.
And we're back here at the 200th episode of Boom and Bust. Thanks for this incredible ride that we've been on together. Here with Patrick Luciani. He is a senior political writer for The Hub. We're talking about homelessness. I had to cut you off there, Patrick, but I do want to talk about, you were juxtaposing what's happening in Houston in the U.S. versus San Francisco and Seattle. So please continue with your thoughts on that.
Well, in Houston, the argument has been, of course, the homeless are attracted to places where they can live outside all year round. You don't find the same kind of homelessness, for instance, in Florida or in Texas, places that are actually warmer than parts of California and San Francisco. If you've been to San Francisco, you realize it's not the warmest place in the world. And the same thing with Seattle and Washington. But they enforce the law there. They basically have a different program. They basically don't allow tents to arise in public spaces, under bridges, and so on. California does. Los Angeles does. Culver City, which is just next to Los Angeles, doesn't have the homeless problem, the tents that are going up, et cetera, et cetera. But they do have a growing problem in Los Angeles to the point that, and in San Francisco, the point that it's affecting the lifestyle of citizens in those areas to the extent that some of them are moving out. The thing is that in San Francisco and in California, they've decreased the level of law that they basically enforce.
Right.
They tolerate injection sites. They don't enforce municipal bylaws regarding camping. In fact, they even, in a sense, encourage more lawlessness in those areas. And so it shouldn't be any surprise that these tent cities are springing up and getting worse every year. And I think that the public has pretty much had enough of this. And there's going to be a day of reckoning, I think, in the coming months and in perhaps the next election in the US, that you're going to see the progressives who have supported these policies pay the political price for these programs. Now in Toronto, we're nowhere near, Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, and so on, nowhere near the problems they have in the United States, but we were creeping towards the same kind of problem here. Right. And if we hadn't sort of stopped it, this problem was simply going to get worse.
And I'd like to make this point, we'll sort of tie this up and then look to some remedies. But, the point that you're making, I believe, and Schellenberger's making in the States is you're actually not helping these people. Their addictions get worse. Their health outcomes get worse. The violence gets worse. Rape and murder gets worse in these encampments. It's not a pleasant life, is it?
No, it's a miserable life. It's an extraordinarily bad thing. And when you mix the addictions and the medical health problems, and we know that the majority of people in the streets of Toronto have very serious addiction and medical health medical health problems, mental health concerns. We see it in the city all the time. We see people who basically need help other than, they need safe places to live. They can't be living in doorways and sleeping in doorways and so on. And our parks were turning into how can I put it? Well, you could see what they were turning into. And the mayor simply had no other alternative but to bring this to an end. Now, of course, many of the homeless found places. The media complains that many of the homeless don't like being in shelters. There's no privacy, et cetera, et cetera. But given our winters and given our conditions, it was the most humane thing to do.
No, indeed. And I do want to talk about prescriptions because I think it is important that we lay out another vision here, that it's not just rounding up these poor, unfortunate people and out of sight, out of mind. That's not what this topic or this conversation is about. It's about the best outcomes possible and approaches that actually can be more effective than just leaving embankments in public spaces. So we'll get to that topic with Patrick Luciani. He's a senior political writer for The Hub. After this break, please stay with us. We'll be right back. And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Patrick Luciani. He is a senior political writer for The Hub. We're talking about the homelessness issue and kind of like the industry that unfortunately feeds on these unfortunate people. Patrick, wanted to switch it in our last segment to potential different approaches, new ways to deal with this. Have you seen anything in your examination of Canadian or American cities that have a better style of reform? You mentioned Houston, for instance, places in Florida. What did they do that is better than what is being done in, say, San Francisco or that Canadian cities can maybe learn from?
They've allowed shelters to be built in those cities, and I think cities like Boston are doing the same thing. They're moving more and more to that model. Public housing is a very expensive thing. Mm-hmm. So that's always going to be a problem for governments. Providing adequate housing is always going to be a bit of a problem. And so, but they provide shelters. They provide a lot of medical care and psychiatric care in these places. Now, it's not an ideal life, but it's much better than the alternative, where you simply allow a rampant level of lawlessness to exist. And so it's bad for the homeless themselves, and it's certainly bad for their neighbors and society. If there's a lesson here, is that enforcing the law basically is actually a much more compassionate way to go than simply allowing lawlessness to exist, thinking that you're actually accommodating yourself to the homeless. You aren't. You're making it worse for them as well.
When you say shelters, are these the large shelters that we're used to? Are they smaller? How would you describe them?
Well, they're kind of both. They would be actually community shelters and also larger shelters that we have here in the city. It's very difficult to know exactly. We have solutions on a small scale here, but we don't have an answer for everyone, because people who are on the street all have different problems. Some of them are transient, some of them are very short-term problems. People basically who find themselves, unfortunately, living in their car for a while because of economic circumstances, personal problems, etc. The ones that I'm talking about are long-term chronic problems. The homeless who can never find adequate work, for instance, can't hold down a job, struggling with their addictions throughout their entire lives. These are the people that basically need long-term care, and they can't find that on the street. And we mustn't allow that to actually happen.
What should government be doing more of then? You mentioned more shelters. Is that the federal government responsibility, provincial? How do you see this going?
Well, it's municipal, mainly, predominantly municipal. Okay. And they need, obviously, the financial support federally and provincially as far as this is concerned. But I think this has to be taken care of at the municipal level. The provinces aren't going to go in, I think, and carry out and enforce municipal laws, for instance.
Right.
So I would think that this is a municipal issue that has to be taken care of at the local level.
We've got less than a minute left in our program here. Would you see this as a possible topic of discussion in the next municipal elections then?
Well, it's always going to be at the top of the agenda. People see it as a problem all throughout the whole city. And if we don't sort of compassionately approach the problem, we're going to find ourselves in a difficult situation. So the mayor started, did the right thing. Of course, there would be a political price to pay if he hadn't, I think. But we have to get away from the illusion that somehow this problem is a housing and a cost problem. It isn't. And we see that, of course, in the States where rents have gone up, prices have gone up everywhere. But the homelessness problem is different throughout the whole country.
We're going to have to leave it at that for now, Patrick. Thank you so much for joining me. I know it's an important topic, and I appreciate your writing on it. And hopefully we'll have you back soon.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for joining me for my 200th Boom and Bust show with Patrick Luciani, talking about the issue of homelessness, a very important one. Looks like it'll be important in the next election cycle as well. Thanks for joining me.